great political scientist and thinker Harold Laski. But I also mentioned Blum, the former Prime Minister of France, who died within a week of Laski's death. Now, I want this afternoon to tell you something more about Blum. There were great similarities between these two eminent men. First, they were both Jews. Secondly, they were both exquisite writers. Third, they were both great social reformers. And just like Harold Laski, Blum also comes from a distinguished and well-to-do, scholarly Jewish family. Now, his life, that is his political life, or shall we say his creative life, was altogether different. That is, the beginning was altogether different than Laski. He was primarily the littérateur, the man of letters, the what the French call the great homme de lettres, a critique. He was the essay. He was the man who, first and foremost, took an interest in the intellectual and in the spiritual life of France and of Europe. And it is most interesting that as a very young man, when he finished the École Normale and he studied philosophy, and then he took up law, he gave up the practice of law and devoted his time to philosophy, to poetry, and to the dramatic art. And Blum became one of the finest and most exquisite essayists in France of the younger generation. It was Laski who first encouraged a number of great writers that later became world famous. It is enough to mention a man like Marcel Proust, probably the greatest genius in French, if not in European literature, of this century. And this century has seen some very eminent and some very profound writers with tremendous influence on European and American literature. It was Blum who first published his weekly literary essay, which caused in France almost a minor revolution in the intellectual sphere. It was Blum who, as a friend of another great writer, André Gide, was to him a great help in the first years of his literary career. It was Blum, as a friend and co-worker with a great tribune of France, Jean Jaurès. I wonder how many remember now his name here. Jean Jaurès, the great socialist, the great Democrat, who was the first victim of World War I, because he tried with all his power to avoid the first conflagration of Europe. And just like Harold Laski, Blum was not a man of the people, or what is commonly called the man of the people. He did not speak the language, even, of the common man. He spoke his exquisite French with great charm and wit, which was a different French than the argot usually required, or as some imagine it is required, by the leader of a popular democratic socialist movement. And yet, Blum became one of the profoundest influences in the European socialist world. And no one in France, since Jean Jaurès was assassinated in 1914, no one, I say, in France, was so much adored, yes, that is the word, adored by the French people, than this aesthete, this beautiful, dreaming man of a better world. Let me tell you something about Blum. You see, sometimes, particularly now, I should say, in this country, the word socialist is being so confused with communism, with rebel-rousing and bloody revolution, that people have simply lost either the sense of value or the sense of reason completely. You see, in Europe, we had a tradition of socialists who were not rebel rousers, who were the very least to say about them. They hated bloody revolution as much as you and I. And Blum was a man who anybody might have imagined would be fit only for the salon or for the fine excluded study. But Blum would have been untrue to himself if he would have remained aloof and only interested in his literary, in his artistic, in his creative life of beauty. What he wanted was to share that life with as many as possible. And if he could contribute something to the enlightenment and to the happiness of men, he felt it his duty to do. Just as there were a number of socialists who came from the most aristocratic and from the wealthiest and sometimes from the bourgeois classes, people, that were not professional revolutionaries or socialists, but people who had an aesthetic approach, a moral approach. I mean, men like William Morris, the great English poet, even a man like Oscar Wilde, who certainly was not interested in economic problems of the world, but simply in the soul of man. And you remember his magnificent essay, The Soul of Man, that's what it's called, The Soul of Man in a Socialist Society. And out of that line of people came also men like Blum. It was immoral to live in a society in which there is so much misery, unhappiness, backwardness, and poverty, disease, ignorance. How could William Morris ask, how could these people love and appreciate and enjoy a Mozart or Bach or Shakespeare or Racine when they come home tired, rejected, miserable, into a hovel of poverty and degradation? How can these people enjoy the things of the Spirit? And how can we artists, writers, poets, painters, musicians, how can we go on producing this beauty for a few only? That was exactly what Blum thought at the beginning of this century. Now, let me remind you of a beautiful word by an American. It is a grand mistake, said this American, to think of being great without goodness. And I pronounce it as certain that there was never yet a truly great man that was not, at the same time, truly virtuous. Now, these profoundly true words were written by Benjamin Franklin nearly 225 years ago. Leon Blum, who died only recently, at the age of 78, was not only great in human goodness, in virtue, but also in his nobility of spirit, in his superb intellectual quality. Like his younger contemporary and friend, who died a week before him in England, Harold Laski, about whom I spoke to you last week, Leon Blum was born of a wealthy and cultured Jewish family in Alsace. Like Laski, he had a fine academic education. Okay? Blum was drawn to that broad studying philosophy and law. Like Laski, Blum was drawn to that broad humanity, the suffering, the exploited, the have-nots of this world. He became a socialist because he could not live and enjoy the beauties of life in a world of man-made misery, poverty, inequality, of hunger and disease. Things that can be prevented. He was not a socialist by profession. He himself, like Laski, as I said, was successful, brilliant, from a well-to-do middle-class home, but that great moral striving for justice and human rights, a prophetic quality which he inherited from his Jewish ancestors, that social justice and the ethical principles without which no civilization, no culture, it can exist. Like Laski, he was a wonderfully gifted writer and a most cultured and moving speaker. But unlike Laski, he was not a scientist. No, he was not that precise logician, but rather, I would say, a poet, an homme de lettres, a man of the most exquisite mind and heart, and an intellect par excellence. And it is characteristic that his literary career, that Leon Blum began with a charming and delightfully wise book called Nouvelles Conversations de Goethe avec Eckermann, imaginary conversations of the greatest German poet Goethe with his famous biographer Eckermann. And he published the book anonymously in 1902. With his great friend that I mentioned before, the noble French tribune Jean Jaurès, he took part in the Dreyfus campaign. The campaign, I need hardly remind you, to free the French Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused as a German spy and was rotting away on Devil's Island. Like Émile Zola, the powerful French novelist, who took up, together with Clemenceau and Anatole France, the case for Dreyfus, which split France in half, Leon Blum was working ceaselessly with Jaurès for the liberation and exoneration of that unhappy man, Captain Dreyfus, whom everybody knew was innocent, and that he was only convicted because the French military and reactionary forces needed very bad a scapegoat, preferably a Jewish one. And like another man, a journalist from Vienna, who lived then in France and was the ideal, assimilated European, who knew nothing about his Jewish ancestry, the Dreyfus affair made him into a confident and proud Jew. That other man was later to become the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. And it was not so long ago when Leon Blum said farewell to the bones and ashes of Theodor Herzl, went from Vienna to rest in Israel, about which he traveled. Leon Blum also, all his life, at least since the famous Dreyfus affair, believed that the Jews must have, as a people, must have a home of their own. In his honor, there is today one of the finest colonies in Israel called Blum. But let us go back to France. Since that time, that is, since the time when he became actively engaged in fighting for justice, Leon Blum was not only the brilliant, witty Frenchman, one of the finest literary and theater critics, but he was a French Jew who demanded justice for his people and for the people of France, as for every human being. Since 1919, that is, during the turbulent years of the First World War, when Leon Blum was elected to the French Chamber of Deputies, Parliament, and became later the editor of the well-known French socialist daily Le Populaire, Leon Blum had the greatest influence in the ranks of the French left, and no one was better loved, adored, and really felt as if he were one of the people, though, as I said, he was not, he never could be one of the people. There was no aloofness in him, but there was something in his exquisite culture, in his very figure, in his very face, something so that kept him a little bit aloof from the masses. Again, here, like Laski, he was hated by the French reactionaries and by the communists. No one in France was more hated than Leon Blum by the French Communist Party. Of course, it was all directed from Moscow, about whom they wrote since the first days of the revolution, since 1917, that Leon Blum is a greater enemy of communism than the French reaction. On many occasions, his life was in danger. He was several times brutally assaulted with knives and nearly clubbed to death at the instigation of that black reactionary, Charles Maurois. He is also a very gifted writer, but one of the most perfidious and perverted reactionary minds in France, who openly called for Leon Blum's assassination, and with a kitchen knife. Now it is the same Charles Maurois who has been sentenced to a very heavy prison term as a Nazi collaborator, as a man who was guilty in selling himself and the people of France to the Nazi barbarians. together with a man like Leon Daudet, another great reaction, who hate Leon Blum. Now the hatred and vilification of Leon Blum by the reactionaries and the communists was that to the first he was a Jewish socialist, and to the latter Leon Blum was against the tyranny of a class and they substituting for one evil a still greater evil. Like that the great American Henry George, Leon Blum believed that the ideal of socialism is grand and noble. And here Henry George's words. It is that I am convinced that it is possible of realization. But such a state of society cannot be manufactured. It must grow. Society is an organism, not a machine. That is why Leon Blum was all his life opposed to violent measures of a bloody revolution, because such revolution never change anything. It merely substitutes one tyranny for another, and sometimes a worse. But Blum had faith in the human spirit, and in the spirit of goodness and understanding. He believed that through reasonableness and re-education of society, we can change the present conditions, which waste so much of men's energy and brings with it so much unhappiness, poverty, and war. The enlightenment of man was the first duty of the citizen, everyone. But Leon Blum was above all interested in the individual in society, not alone, never alone, in the mass. He was always appealing to the dignity of the individual and to the individual human family. That is why he was so interested in happy marriages, in successful marriages, because this is the beginning of a healthy and a good society, as a basis of a broader, of a wider, of a greater vision in life. It was Leon Blum, the aesthete, the lover of life and of spiritual beauty, that drove him to socialism and to social reforms. And like Laski, we lost in Blum a great spiritual force. A great spiritual force in the European democratic tradition. And we lost him at a time when we needed him most. Good afternoon.